right, so hopefully you guys are seeing the Unity editor here. So this is the default layout of the editor. And what I want to do is just kind of walk through a couple different windows here. So on the left-hand side, we have what we call the scene hierarchy. And this is where you're going to build up your 3D scene. And it contains what we call game objects. So by default, we have a game object for the main camera, as well as the directional light. Now moving down from the scene hierarchy, we have the project hierarchy. So here on the bottom is everything contained within our project. In the project hierarchy, you have things like sound effects or 3D models. There's also textures, and this is really where you put all the content that you're going to be using in your game. From there, on the right-hand side, we have the inspector. So the inspector gives us information about the object that we're selecting within the scene or the project. So here I'm selecting the main camera, and you can see it over there on the right-hand side. And last but not least, here in the center, we have what we call the scene view. This is actually a 3D representation within the editor itself of how you start to build up and add logic within your content. Now there's also the game view, which sits kind of behind the scene view. And this is what the camera is rendering. So you can see when I'm selecting on the camera, you can actually see a little preview here in the bottom right. And that's where we're going to be placing all our content. So within the game view, it's all in view. So again, just to go over them quickly, we have the inspector on the left. We have the project hierarchy on the bottom. We have the scene view here in the middle, and we have the inspector on the right. So let's go back to my presentation here. So to create a new project, first we've opened up the Unity Hub. I've clicked that new button where you can see the 2019.4. If you have different versions installed, you can click that little down arrow. And then I've named my project Workshop and hit Create. So from there, that gives us the ability to create a project, and then it should load up a new version of Unity. So that should look a little bit like this. That's what we have there. And from there, I've kind of gone over the different parts of the editor itself. And this is just kind of some terminology that will be helpful when you continue to kind of learn and understand Unity. So on the left, we have the scene hierarchy, the project hierarchy, where we have things like different textures or sound effects, different scripts, how we start to piece together our game. In the center there, we have the scene view. This is where we put together our 3D world. And on the right, we have the inspector, which gives us information about what we're selecting. So the next thing we want to do is, let me hop back here.
So Dan, just to interrupt you a little bit, several people ask for a license during installation. I don't think it needs a license, but how do they get it?
Yeah. So basically, when you first start up, you do need to create an account. So I kind of forgot about that. Through the account creation process, you can select the personal edition. So this is basically Unity is free for personal use. If you're using it professionally, we ask that you license it. But just as for free use, you can do the personal license there, but you will need to create an account. So I forgot about that. And yeah, depending on your age, you might need to ask your parents for some help with that. So yeah, so that hopefully gives helps with that. So now I'm going to go back to the editor here. So here we are within the Unity scene, and what I want to talk about now is navigating around our scene. So this is important when you are starting to create a lot of this content, is you need to be able to navigate around in this scene view. So in order to do that, I have my mouse over here within the scene view. And the first hotkey that I use is holding down the Alt key, or on Mac, it's the Option/Alt key, and then clicking the left button on my mouse. And this allows me to rotate around. So you can see I'm kind of viewing things from different angles, and really it's moving this kind of scene camera around to look at the different objects. And this is especially important in 3 dimensions, or in 3D. The next thing we can do is we can use the scroll wheel on our mouse, or it would be potentially this kind of scroll gesture on a trackpad. And this allows us to zoom in and out. So you can see kind of zooming in like that. And again, rotating around with the Alt key, zooming in, and then zooming out. So this is another kind of important gesture. And then the last one is we can use the right click gesture, so on our mouse, and then we can use the W, A, S, and D key to kind of fly around. So here you can see I'm moving around in the space. And again, this allows us to kind of position ourselves at different areas within the scene. So this is an important part when starting to understand how to work within Unity, is just understanding some of the controls on how to navigate the scene. So let me go ahead and go back to the slide here. And I'm just going to kind of take a peek into chat here and see some of the Q&A. But yeah, these are kind of the main hotkeys for navigating around the scene. And as we start to add more content, you'll see how these are important. And we are going to start to add some 3D objects here within the middle. The question was, do the arrow keys work? I think they do. I think those work, again, similarly to up, down, left, and right, or W, A, S, and D. So there was a question about when creating a project, just leave it on the default, which is going to be 3D. All right, so it says after the download. All right. And so for Windows, I'm using the Alt key to do the rotation. So now let's hop back in the editor and let's actually start creating some content. So the first thing I want to do in order to create content is I'm going to click this little plus button in the scene hierarchy. So this gives me the option to select different objects, and I'm going to go to a 3D object here, and I'm going to create a cube. And what that does is you'll notice now I can zoom in and I have a cube here within my space. So I can start to click on these little handles here, and this allows me to move it around. So here you can see I'm moving it around in the X, Y, and Z axes. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create another cube. So we're going to create 2 cubes. So here's my other cube. You want to move it up here a little bit. And one thing to note is with 3D, you have to be a little bit careful because right now it kind of looks like these cubes are next to each other. But if I hold the Alt key and look around, you'll see that they're not actually that close at all. And this is because we're just looking at it from a single perspective. So this is something to keep in mind where you need to visualize and look at things in 3 dimensions here. So here I'm able to move it around. And the last thing we're going to do is create another 3D object. So we're clicking this plus button in the upper left, 3D object, and a sphere. And now with our sphere, we can do similar things. So now I want to talk a little bit about how I can start to move, rotate, and scale. So what we can do here is, by default, we should see these little icons here for kind of grabbing and moving it. And the next thing we can do is we can hit the E key on our keyboard, which gives us a different gizmo for rotating. So now I can click on one of these lines here and rotate my object around. And finally, we can hit the R key, which is the ability to scale. So I'm going to hold Alt, and now we can scale it in certain axes. So we can do like that, or we can uniformly scale it. So that's scaling it in all the axes by clicking this center icon here and moving it up and then moving it down. So the next thing to do here is to create objects and try to move them around. Now, one little tip that I forgot to put in my presentation, but potentially you can actually get to a place here in Unity where you don't see any objects. So here I've created some objects, but I don't see any within my scene. And to fix that, we can click on our objects here within the scene view. So you can see I've clicked on this sphere. Hold our mouse over the scene view and hit the F key. So F as in Frank. And that will actually focus the object here within our view. So now we can start to see our objects again. So I'm going to walk through that one more time. So I just deleted them. So I hit the plus key in the scene hierarchy, go to 3D objects cube. I can move this around. Then I'm going to create another 3D object cube. And if you're on rotate and you want to get back to move or translate, you can hit the W key. So that's how to get back to that. And then E is rotate. And the last thing is we want to create one more sphere. So I've created a sphere, and then we can hit R to scale it. So here I'm scaling it uniformly. We can rotate it as well, but it's not really easy to visualize or understand on a sphere since it's completely round. So I'm just kind of scaling it up and moving it around in space. So let me hop back into the slides here. So the second thing we did here was add some objects. So in our scene hierarchy, we have the ability to create objects. So we hit create, and then I've created 2 cubes here. So first you go create 3D object cube, and then I've also created 1 sphere. So that allows us to just have what we call 3D primitives. So this is just kind of 3D objects that we can start laying out that represent a lot of these different shapes. Now, the next important part here is that how to manipulate our objects. So when you click on an object, the 3 different ways you can manipulate it are to translate or move it, and you can get that gizmo with the W key. The next one is to rotate it, and you can get that gizmo with the E key. And finally, you can scale it, and you can get that with the R key. So again, one more time with the create, you can find that in the scene hierarchy in the plus button. You can also right click within the scene hierarchy to get the create menu as well. And here we've created 2 cubes and 1 sphere. And then to manipulate them, we can do the different hotkeys after we've selected our object. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to start to lay out my scene by moving some of my objects around. So here I am back in Unity. And what I want to do first is I want to create a floor. So in order to do that, I'm going to rotate this cube here to be a little flatter. So something like that. And now I'm going to scale it out in these different directions. So here we have kind of a large flat surface. Something like that, make it a little thinner. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to create a ramp. So to do that, I'm again going to take this other cube I've created, scale it out a little bit, maybe make it a little thinner, and then now I want to rotate it. And one thing to keep in mind is we always want to be navigating and looking at our 3D objects here from these different angles. That's to really understand how they're set up. So maybe I'll make this ramp a little bit longer. So I'm going to hit the R key, which allows us to go back to scale, and we can kind of scale it out like that. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to take this sphere, and I want the sphere to roll down the ramp. So here I want to position it, and maybe I'll make it a little smaller, something like this. And again, I'm kind of continuing to rotate around. And now it looks like our sphere is kind of on top of this ramp. And someone asked, how do I delete objects? So if we had an extra cube that we wanted like this, we can just hit the delete key on Windows, and it's the Command plus backspace key on Mac. You can also always right click on an object and go to delete. There was another question about, is this available on Chromebook? Unfortunately, it's not available on Chromebook. And I'll talk a little bit about how to put color or expand this in a moment. So once we've lined up our objects here, we've scaled, positioned, and rotated them around. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select my sphere and go down in the inspector. In the inspector, at the very, very bottom, we have this button here called Add Component. From there, this gives us access to all of the different built-in components in Unity. What I want to do from there is I want to navigate to Physics, Rigid Body. Now, which is right here. Now there's a little easier way to get there, is that after you've selected the add component button, you can start typing RIGI, which is the first part of rigid body. And here I want to make sure I'm using just the rigid body, not the rigid body 2D. So there I've added my rigid body. And now what this allows us to do is we've now told this sphere to interact with physics. So we've given it a physics property. So what that means is that if we start the simulation, or if we do what we call playing our game, then our ball should roll down this ramp. So let's go ahead and hit that play button right here. And now we'll see what it looks like here in a moment. And there's our ball, and it looks like it rolled off the edge there. So again, just to kind of walk through that really quickly, I'm going to go back and create these primitives here and talk about that last step where I've basically gone and adjusted some of the different primitives. So here we have our cube. I'm going to move this one, hit the R key to scale it. So let's go ahead and make a floor a little bit like that. Now I'm going to grab this other cube, moving it around here with the different gizmos. I'm going to rotate it a little bit, and then I'm going to scale it to be more like a ramp. So that looks good. And then lastly, let's get this sphere. So hit W to translate or move. Position it something like this, making sure that we're checking it from these different angles. And then on the sphere itself, I'm adding the rigid body script by going to add component at the very bottom of the inspector, typing in RIGI to add rigid body. And then at the top of Unity, there's this play, pause, and forward or step. And I'm gonna click the play button. And if we did it right, we should be able to see our sphere roll off. Now this is, again, the game view, and this is what the camera renders. If we wanted to adjust what the camera renders, we could click on the camera here, and we could move this just like any other object. So here I've moved it off to the side, and now if I hit the play button, you should see that simulation happen there to the side.